Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining our book talk. And I'm Karen Adler, an acquisitions editor here at Harvard Education Press. And I am just delighted to introduce you all to Michael Casserly, the terrific author of The Enduring Promise of America's Great City Schools. Mike Casserly knows all about the importance of our country's urban public schools, and he has served for over 47 years with the Council of Great City Schools, which now represents a coalition of, I hope I'm getting this right, 78 of the nation's largest urban schools. And for 30 of those 47 years, he was the council's executive. He's been the council's executive director. And over his decades of work as director, Mike has worked closely with urban school leaders on many challenges, from the implementation of the Common Core state standards to the crisis of COVID-19, with many other challenges and opportunities in between. And let me say personally, it's been just a pleasure working with Mike. He's a brilliant thought partner and an engaging writer, and has no trouble with HEP's submission specifications, which has been another win for us. And I couldn't put it better than the former Secretary of Education, Arne Duncan, who wrote the foreword for the book, and he calls Mike someone who was viewed by many as the nation's most knowledgeable individual on urban public education. I couldn't agree with more with that. And with that said, I'll now turn it over to HEP Executive Director Jess Fiorillo and Mike Casserly.
Hi, everyone. It's so great to be here. It's so great to be with Mike and with all of you. And huge thanks to Gutman Library for hosting this event for us and coordinating us and getting us all together. Thank you. This is such a wonderful forum for us to launch this new book by Mike Casserly. We're really thrilled to be able to have this conversation with you. Mike, this book, The Enduring Promise of America's Great City Schools, does such a wonderful job of presenting this lovely and thoroughly researched and executed concept of the state of urban schools in America right now, and the promise of schools, and sort of what has worked and what we need to do to continue to work and serve the students and communities in these large urban districts in America. And one of the things you talk about a lot is the role that urban schools play in our lives, in the lives of students and teachers and communities, but also sort of more broadly in the state of democracy in general. And I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about that, about these multiple roles that schools serve and how they contribute to our democratic system.
Thank you, Jess, and thank you so much for the invitation to be here. Also, thank you to Karen. And Jess, thank you for asking this question, because I know that a lot of people right now are concerned about the state of our democracy. And of course, public education can't cure all of the problems and ails that our democracy seems to be going through, at least at the moment. But public schools, public schools, particularly in the cities, play an important role in supporting and nourishing not only our democracy, but our economy and our culture. So when, for example, urban public schools improved our academic performance at a faster rate than the rest of the nation in the 20 years before the pandemic, we support democracy by providing more opportunity for our citizens. It also has the benefit of bolstering our economy and undergirding wages. When we boosted our graduation rates over that same period from 65% to over 80%, and we made sure that our graduates were registered to vote, we strengthened our democracy and swelled our voting rolls at the same time. We did also, at the same time, because we improved our graduation rate, swelled the ranks of higher education. When we welcome and educate and assimilate the millions of immigrant students that come into our cities over the years, we make sure that they are productive new citizens, we also strengthen democracy. And when, as we've done over the decades, have produced countless Nobel Prize winners and civil rights leaders and inventors and authors and entertainers, Supreme Court justices and congressional leaders, military leaders, and the like. We not only support and enrich our culture, but we spur our economy and we strengthen our democracy because we are strengthening the country. Just by the by, 3 out of the 4 current congressional leaders in the U.S. Congress are graduates of the great city schools. And when we as urban schools provide a forum for the discussion and reconciliation of diverse ideas and people, we support democracy by making or by providing one of the few uh, national town halls that exists in the country on a regular basis. We don't have a common religion in this country. We don't have a common ethnicity. We don't have a common race. We don't have a common ancestry. But we do have the public schools to help us provide a common national identity. Democracy really depends on the participation and the knowledge of its citizens. And for all of our shortcomings, the nation's urban public schools help to provide both.
I actually thought one of the interesting things you pointed out in the book was also that while there is a rapid decline in public trust in our systems and institutions, that there remains a very strong belief and support in neighborhood schools. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Americans really like sending their children to the neighborhood public schools. Poll after poll, year after year, show that American citizens really rate their neighborhood public schools rather highly. Now, they may not have the same high rating for public education in general or for public schools in some other neighborhood, but by and large, they give very strong reviews to their neighborhood public schools. One of the things that we saw in the pandemic was that there were people who left the public schools, but we can talk about that in a minute or so. But I think one of the things that is really encouraging is that the American citizenry likes participating in this institution that is meant for them and their children, and they understand what the value of it is, not only for their families, but for the country as a whole.
Yeah, and I think that you use COVID as like this pivot point or this relevant revelatory moment in really defining or illustrating to us the importance of schools and what they're actually currently doing to serve their communities. But I'd love for you to tell us a little bit more about what public schools and local schools did to really rise to the occasion during this huge crisis that we were under during COVID.
Yeah, COVID was an interesting phenomenon, to be sure. Matter of fact, it was much more than interesting. And I use COVID in the book as kind of one of the pivot points in my discussion about urban education. But a lot of people outside of the cities don't fully appreciate the role that their public schools, particularly in urban areas, play in their communities, because these schools provide a lot more than just instruction and academic services. They provide nutrition and food services and medical services and clothing and other social services in ways that you don't see in other communities. And they provide them not just to our kids, but to their families. And in a lot of cases, they also provide many of these services to people in the community, no questions asked. Certainly, COVID kind of took us out of our game of trying to improve our academic performance over the years. But what you saw these public schools do during the pandemic to serve our communities was really extraordinary, and really extraordinary at a scale that a lot of people really just did not appreciate, particularly people outside of the cities. So specifically, our 78 urban school districts across the country, we don't know the exact number, but in the first 2 years of the pandemic, our estimates are that they provided literally hundreds of millions of meals to urban residents, not to just urban public school residents, but students, but to their families, to private school students, to general citizens, to charter schools, and the like. They were probably the biggest social service agency and deliverer of anybody anywhere in the country. They also purchased literally thousands, maybe millions of electronic devices and hotspots to make sure that the children and the families were connected to their schools. Unfortunately, the connectivity that we had to rely on wasn't always the best way to provide instruction, but it wasn't that many of our kids and their families had connections to begin with. So we had to provide a lot of those devices to people. And once the vaccines were finally available, we set up thousands of clinics, volunteered tens of thousands of our nurses across the country to make sure that medicine was provided not only to our kids and to our teachers, but to others in the community who were some of the poorest citizens in the land. And it was one of the ways in which the vaccine initiative was able to reach people in some of the poorest sections of the country. So we did all of that while we were trying to provide instructional services and while we were literally absorbing hundreds of thousands of immigrant families. And we were working, people probably have forgotten this, but the 2020 census was going on at the same time that the pandemic was starting. So we were working on trying to get as many people counted under the census as we possibly could in order to make sure that the undercounts in the urban areas were as small as possible. Now, that all said, the pandemic did take a toll on us. I mean, we emerged from the pandemic more bruised than we were before. We saw some substantial enrollment declines, and we saw some serious learning loss. But we also fell academically less than most of the country did, except in fourth grade math. And I think it was because we had devoted so much time and attention to instruction over the years that we were able to lessen our instructional loss more than other people might have suspected. So overall, what we were doing during the pandemic was not only trying to provide instructional services remotely, we were also trying to provide an extraordinary, really history defining set of social services to urban residents that I think none of us had ever seen before. So
I guess that's a really interesting question to consider is how to balance the priorities of social services versus educational outcomes. Because without the social services, students aren't in a position to be able to absorb any education at all anyway, right? If their stomachs are empty, how are they going to learn their math lessons? So where does the line there? Like how do you make those determinations about what are the baseline social services and what are you willing to sacrifice in terms of learning outcomes?
well, there was never a decision to sacrifice anything in terms of learning outcomes. And there was an ongoing discussion that the superintendents and the school board members from these urban school systems had at the beginning of the pandemic that was really interesting because this question really came up really explicitly. And I just tried to describe it a little bit in chapter 1 and chapter 6 of the book. But when we fully understood what the scale of this pandemic was, and it didn't take long for us to kind of figure that out. that it was going to affect everybody in ways that were really unpredictable in a scale that was unprecedented, that we had no choice as urban school leaders to throw everything we had at what it is our communities were about to face. We did not decide to compromise on instructional quality. It was just instructional quality was not as good in a remote setting, but we just didn't have the option to do anything else. But we decided to do everything we could with all of the resources that we had, and to do it in a way that would support our urban communities.
I think the ability to get that many devices in that many hands of students for learning was absolutely unbelievable. Was there sort of a partnership that helped facilitate, were there partnerships that helped facilitate the delivery of devices to students? How did all of that work?
Well, it was really interesting how a lot of that worked. A lot of our kids did not have devices, and a lot of them also did not have access to the internet. So in a lot of cases, what was happening was that as we deployed our school buses and the like to drop off meals in neighborhoods all over the cities, we were also dropping off devices. We were also setting up hotspots, and we were retrofitting our buses and other vehicles that the school districts had access to, and we would sometimes park those outside of public housing units and provide internet services to the residents of public housing units. We were doing everything that we could think of in order to provide some stopgap in the lack of services that many of our residents had. How this occurred was really not through partnerships except of our own making. What we did was we set up weekly phone calls of all of our superintendents, all of our school boards, all of our chief academic officers, all of our transportation directors, all of our facilities directors, all of our IT directors, et cetera. And we worked out ways in which we could provide the services as best we could during those circumstances. And as everybody came up with innovative ideas and examples of what they were doing, we would share those on our weekly calls so everybody could take advantage of what we were learning and what some of the pitfalls were of what we were trying to do.
Talk more about the Council of Great City Schools, because what an amazing organization that exists sort of just to serve the needs of those members. There's no oversight from outside organizations or districts. Yeah, just can you describe the advantages of having this group working together without having to be constrained by any outside observation and monitoring and everything?
Well, some of this I really tried to describe in chapter 3 of the book, but this was an organization when I took the reins of it in the early 1990s, where we really remade what we wanted the organization to be. And what we wanted the organization to be was an instrument for the improvement of urban public education in the country. Now, we did the same kind of work representing our members that you will see other national education organizations do. But what was different in what we were aspiring to do was to improve our own membership, to be the instruments for our own reform and improvement, and not to have somebody else define us. We weren't sitting around waiting for somebody to save us. We decided to be the instruments for our own improvement. And we were true to that vision over the nearly 30 years that I was executive director of the organization, and I know my successor is taking it forward now. but it made the organization a different kind of group in that it was an independent membership organization that was devoted to nothing else but the improvement of the educational quality of its own members.
Yeah, and I think that you are so clear throughout the book about the focus needing to be on students. That so often school board meetings devolve into, what are we doing with the physical plant? And it's so easy to get distracted by contracts and all kinds of other negotiations. But really, this group focuses on students.
We do, and one of the recommendations that people will see in Chapter 8 of the book is a set of recommendations around the focus of our boards of education in the cities. As you indicated, too many of our boards really focus on who's being hired and what contracts are being delivered and who gets what in the community. And in some ways, it's our own fault because we probably taught the community to expect that of our elected officials and our elected school board members. But truth of the matter is that school board members are really there to define the academic and other goals of the school systems and to monitor progress on those goals. And one of the recommendations that I have made is for more of our urban school boards to devote more of their time and attention at every one of their school board meetings to defining and monitoring the academic performance of their kids. That's what we're in business for, is to improve the learning of children. And we need to do a better job of strengthening that role.
Yeah, and I think it's so clear in the book that you take so many lessons from COVID, but what you really are saying in this book is that what has been revealed through COVID is what the strengths and weaknesses of the systems are in general and how to move forward. And I'd love for you to talk about some of those lessons learned that you talk about in the book. One of the most surprising, maybe surprising or just interesting ones to me was the recommendation of staying focused on the Common Core. Can you talk about that? I think that is, and for reasons other than strictly the content of the Common Core. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yes. I make two sets of kind of observations and lessons in Chapter 8 of the book. One set of kind of lessons learned is what we think we learned from the pandemic. And I think in some ways it's probably still too early to be fully articulate about what we may have learned from that. And the second is what it is we learned over the 20 years before the pandemic that really drove our improvement. And one of the things that that we learned was that focus and attention on academic performance actually matters. And we came to the conclusion after looking at why some of our urban school districts improve faster than others, which I devote chapters 4 and 5 to in the book, it was very clear to us that the Common Core played a very critical role in what the school districts were doing. Not necessarily the content of the Common Core, which is actually quite good and quite coherent, but in what the Common Core spurred us to do in terms of laying out the standards, creating a coherent and cohesive curriculum, reorienting professional development, looking at our assessment systems and the like. What the Common Core really allowed us to do was to reorganize and focus the quality of our academic programs in a way that we had never really done before. So one of the recommendations I have in the book is not to follow the recommendations and observations of a lot of people, which is to jettison the Common Core, but I actually recommended doubling down on the Common Core. And a lot of people at this point, given the fact that the Common Core is about 14 years old right now, given the fact the pandemic has been in between, a lot of people have kind of lost focus of the Common Core and what it was trying to do. But my suggestion is to get back to what the Common Core were trying to do, and that is producing a quality, coherence, and a framework for your instructional program that really did help improve academic performance in places like Chicago, in Miami, in Washington, D.C., in San Diego, and other big city school districts across the country in ways that were not the case in other cities.
Yeah. How do you feel we're doing in COVID recovery now? I can't really, it's easy to say when COVID started, like everything shut down in March of 2020. It's a little more vague about when the sort of end point of COVID came, but do you feel like urban schools are really addressing the what has been revealed by COVID and are really working toward a better future for education? Do you think they're making strides?
Well, I do, but that is the big challenge that all of us have in urban education right now, is to make sure that we transition from that period of crisis management back to a period of instructional improvement. Now, the only results that we have since the pandemic have been one set of National Assessment of Educational Progress scores, and then the excellent work that was done by Tom Kane and at Harvard and Sean Reardon at Stanford, that give us a look on academic performance in reading and math in many school districts across the country, including the cities. In the 30 or so cities that they include in their analysis, many of those cities have actually improved faster than their average statewide improvements. So it gave us a little bit of a glimpse in 2023 that our schools were starting to bounce back. We clearly have a long way to go. And we'll see another update with the 2024 results of NAEP, which will be released in the early part of 2025. I do expect that not only are these systems to get back to their focus on academic performance, but that this is going to take a few years to get fully back. And while the fall off happened pretty rapidly, I suspect that the build back, like a lot of things, is going to be slower than a lot of us would like.
I have a couple of questions on that, but I think it's really fascinating that urban schools are recovering faster. What is your sense? You're talking to the superintendents of these or the principals and leaders of these urban school districts all the time. What do you think they're doing differently that's making them recover faster?
Well, we only have data on about 30 or so of our districts from the Reardon and Kane analysis, so I don't know the results of everybody. We do have kind of generalized state results from many of these districts, but I think two things are at play here. One, we developed some instructional muscle before the pandemic that is still in place in many of our schools. So there's an expertise and capacity there that we had before the pandemic. And two, a lot of the leaders in our urban school districts understood what it takes to get the academic performance that they got. And part of this was just the focus on instructional quality. And so I think a lot of them are quick to get back to that focus as rapidly as they possibly can. Now, that doesn't mean that others in the country aren't trying to do the same thing, but urban public school leaders understand that the public wants better of their urban public schools, and we are not immune from that desire on the part of the public, and we want to give them what they want.
I also think it's really interesting to think about the how the social services that urban schools delivered during COVID may or may not have continued, because I think there's, thinking holistically about children's performance in school, really, we have to think about how healthy they are in school and out of school. So do you feel like those social services have continued at the same level? Did COVID sort of point out areas of social service that that became very clear that it would be necessary to continue, or what's your feeling on that part of it?
Yeah, this is going to be an interesting thing to see. The social services that we provided during the pandemic were really critical to a vast swath of our citizenry, and we were able to do it in part because the community needed it. And we actually started it before there was any federal aid in place to reimburse us. We didn't know whether we were going to get reimbursed for any of this or not, but we decided to do it anyway. We certainly advocated in Congress for, what became the American Rescue Plan and the previous rescue packages that were signed into law before the ARP. And that helped bolster our ability to provide some of the social services and do some of the other things that we were doing. Now that the American Rescue Plan dollars expire at the end of this month, just in a week or so, it's going to be really interesting to see whether or not we can provide and sustain some of the social services that we were able to provide, because we will not have the resources that we had before. And one of the lessons that we learned, not a huge lesson, we knew it before, but we had to kind of relearn it. But despite our focus on academic achievement, it's clear to us that kids are more than their test scores and their academic performance. They're made up of all kinds of things, and the social emotional struggles and other mental health service issues that they've had and continue to have are an ongoing challenge, not only for urban public schools, but for public schools all over the country. How it is we are able to sustain some of that is going to be an ongoing challenge. And I suspect that a lot of our school districts just start building in mental health supports into their ongoing instructional work in ways that they had not done before the pandemic.
What would you say is the number one or the biggest takeaway that you and maybe the Council of Great City Schools take from COVID that you want to move forward overall?
One thing that I think there was a lot of kind of description of what urban school leaders were going through and how they were going through it uh, over that period. One thing was true in the characterization of what was happening in urban education, and that is after a few months to a couple of years of this, people were downright exhausted from what was going on. What was not true, that often got depicted in the press and by various commentators of one stripe or another, was chaos. It was not chaos. There were people who are working absolutely tirelessly to provide a range of services at a scale that was really unprecedented in American educational history. And one of the things that I would like for people to take away from the work that they did and the book that I am presenting through this talk is a sense of optimism. I want people to be optimistic about the the focus, the determination, the skills of people who are running our public education systems in our major cities. They are some of the best, the brightest, the smartest, and the most determined educators any place in the world. And having worked with them for the better part of 50 years, I have enormous confidence, despite all of the challenges they have, that they are up to the job of getting us out of the hole that the pandemic created. So a sense of optimism about the work ahead of us, I think, is what my main takeaway is for people.
That's so great. And so positive for the future. In general, what made you write this book and write it now? Why this moment for this book?
There were really two reasons why I wanted to write it. One was that I wanted to provide a more balanced, maybe a more positive narrative around urban public education. There is a lot of discussion about urban schools. They are the center of all kinds of things, good and bad, in the nation. But often the narrative describing urban public education is a very woeful description about all of the challenges they have and all the difficulties they have. And I wanted to provide a more balanced, more hopeful, more optimistic, a more forward-looking narrative around public education, and also provide some of the evidence for that hopefulness, which is why in chapter 2 and chapter 7 of the book, you'll see a fair amount of statistical evidence around what urban public schools have done. The second main reason was that even though urban public school leaders are cognizant of what happened before the pandemic, there has been an extraordinary turnover of urban school leaders in just the last few years because of the pandemic. Of the 78 urban school leaders that make up the great city schools, over 60 of those turned over in just the last 3 years. So there has been an enormous change in just the leadership. And what I wanted to do was to provide a description of some of the lessons learned about why some of our urban school districts made more academic progress than others, and try to inform a new generation of leaders about what worked and what didn't work as well.
I'm sure we have people on who are listening now who are teachers, who are principals, who are district leaders. What do you think are the most important things for them to be considering in moving forward and contributing to the promise of our great schools, urban or otherwise? Where should they really be? What should be the North Star?
I think the North Star is really pretty simple, and that is focusing on the improvement of the quality of classroom instruction in all of our schools, not just in the nation's urban public schools, but in all schools, urban, suburban, and rural alike. And frankly, it was the common ingredient of all of the urban school districts that we looked at that made the fastest improvement on academic and performance. And that was the relentless attention to making sure that the quality of instruction in our schools was second to none.
Yeah, that is such a great message. And just to follow up on that, do you think that there is the room for a sort of a parallel organization a parallel organization to the Council of Great City Schools that might address rural schools and rural education?
I think there are rural education organizations around. I don't think they quite focus on instructional quality in the way that we do in the cities, which is why, in some ways, contrary to the stereotypes of a lot of people, urban public schools are in many ways kind of a, a pretty forward-looking, forward-thinking bunch of folks. But I think there's room for urban school associations and associations of other suburban school districts to adopt some of the same approaches that we used over the years around the sole purpose of improving the quality of public education in this country.
Oh, Mike, this has been such a great conversation, and we are so thrilled to be launching this book with you. And we did leave 15 minutes for Q&A. I encourage people to drop any comments or questions into the Q&A feature, and I will be looking through it and passing those questions on. Feel free to send your thoughts our way. And I do see in the Q&A right now, Mike, there's a lovely note from Mary Grasso Neal, congratulating you on the book, which is so lovely.
Thank you, Mary. Appreciate it. Hope to see you soon.
So if there are any other questions that we can take, anything specific, like do you have questions about what you in particular can do as a result listening in? Do you have questions about outcomes or comments or stories you want to share about how your school or your district has recovered from COVID or continues to recover from COVID? We'd love any feedback that you might have.
So, Jess, would it be helpful at all for me to give a quick outline of the book while we're waiting for questions?
Sure. Yeah, that would be great.
All right, just a quick rundown. There are just 8 chapters in this book. In the first book, the first chapter, I give an argument for why urban education is important and the role that we play in the strength of the country, the economy, and democracy. In chapter 2, I spend considerable time analyzing whether urban schools have actually improved over time, whether or not we've improved faster than the nation, whether or not we add any value to the academic performance of our kids, and whether or not we provide a reasonable return on investment. In chapter 3, I give some of the history of the national backdrop of what we were trying to do to get urban schools locally to focus on academic improvement. And just stop me if I'm rattling on while people have coming up with questions.
No, I'll just stop you for 1 second and ask
Yep.
Mayanne if she might put up the slide that has the QR code for the book. The book publishes really soon and you can pre-order now. And Mayanne will flash up the slide that has the information about it. But yeah, please continue going on. You did have one more comment from Matt Talon, who says congratulations on the book too, and has worked with you in the past and is looking forward to reading it.
Yes, I very much enjoyed working with Matt. Thank you, Matt. So chapter 4 and 5 is we take a look at those urban school districts who over the years have shown inordinate academic improvement on the National Assessment of Educational Progress and other measures, and then urban school districts that did not show as much improvement. And we compare and contrast on the same variables the practices of those 2 sets of districts to see if we can determine what really distinguishes the practices and features of each of those school districts. And then in chapter...
Mike, I
Yeah.
do have a question. I have a really good question, then we can continue on.
Okay.
So we have someone asking, what is your view of the impact of the charter school movement on urban education? It's a great question. Oh, and I have another question too after that one. So
Okay. I'm not really honestly quite sure what the direct impact has been. I know the charter school advocacy community would argue that they have played um, uh, a competitive feature on urban schools. But in looking at that research, I think some of that may be true, but it's not clear to me that it's quite true in the way that many of the advocates would argue. One thing that did happen during the pandemic is that we did lose quite a number of students to charter schools across the country. It's not clear whether those students will come back or they'll stay in charter schools. We've had uh, transitions like this, not quite like this, happened in the past, and people will move back and forth. So over the long run, I'm really interested to see what happens here.
We have another question from a listener who is a school board member in Dorchester, Mass, and who says that that she experienced very many similar challenges, and they did tech access and meals for kids. But another important consideration for them was ensuring students still had music education. And she's wondering if there are other urban schools that you know of or that you've been following that included the arts as a central part of the education that students received during COVID and the significance of that.
Yes, it was actually quite interesting that one of the things that many of these urban school districts did, particularly in the non-school hours and in the summer months, is that they set up kind of auxiliary programs around music and the arts, dance and sports and the like, to keep their students engaged and also to address many of the mental health issues that they were experiencing. I will note that one of the really interesting examples that we had in the District of Columbia Public Schools before the pandemic was that the leader there, Guy Henderson, devoted an extraordinary amount of time making sure that every student in the school system had music lessons, art lessons. They even made sure that the students knew how to swim and ride a bike.
Wow.
So it was, um, uh, nobody thought that ignoring the so-called non-academic subjects was viable here at all. In fact, many of those leaders really thought that music programs, arts programs, and other programs were the keys to addressing the mental health and social needs that many of the students had.
Oh, I love that. Another great question here about um, social studies curriculum. And the question is around, do you recommend a renewed focus on civics curriculum to help strengthen democracy?
I do. And I think it's one of those areas that our schools have not been as strong on over the years as they really need to be. Civics education, history, social studies is really critical at this point when it's not always clear that the American citizenry fully understands and appreciates how the nation and its government at the federal, state, and local levels actually work. I think it is a priority that we are long past needing to address.
Yep. That was it for questions that we have now. Anybody who has one last question to throw up into the Q&A, we will take it. Otherwise, I think that we will wrap up and give people just a minute back. And I love the questions that we got. Those were fabulous questions. And Mike, just thank you so much for publishing this book with us, for bringing this to a broader readership, and a huge thanks to Gutman Library for having this as the initial Gutman Library book talk of the season. what
Well,
the board?
I want to, Jess, I want to thank you and your great team at the Harvard Education Press for the work that they did on the book. Your team helped me make this better than it otherwise would be, and helped me tell a coherent story. I think one of the great challenges of this book was that there was so much potential content that could have gone into the book that your people were great at helping me think through what I could leave on the cutting room floor without compromising what the overall purpose of the book was. But you have a great team. I just want to thank you for all the work that you devoted to it.
Oh, well, you are more than welcome. And I'm glad it was a great experience. Well, Marianne, I think with that we can wrap up, and thank you to everyone for joining us, and hopefully we'll see you at the next great Gutman Book Talk. And thank you to Mike again.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.